This week on the show, we cover an interview about Unix Architecture Evolution. We also have another vBSDcon trip report. We also show you how to teach an old Unix about Backspace. There's a new NUMA support coming to FreeBSD, and the OpenBSD folks are working on stack pointer checking. And we cover all this in this week's episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 231, Unix Architecture Evolution, recorded on the 24th of January 2018. Hello, I'm Benedict Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
So, we're back with our weekly episode, like always, and we have great headlines this week, starting with Unix Architecture Evolution from the 1970 PDP-7 to the 2017 FreeBSD. So this is an interview and on the eve of FOSDEM with one of the more prominent speakers. So we could do this in Q&A form. So I read the question and Alan answers it as a proxy pretty much. So this is over at the FOSDEM site. And the first question is, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Oh, could you pronounce the speaker's name?
I have never met him, and it's Greek, I think. Diomedes Spinalis. I'm not sure. Sorry if we messed that up.
That's a pretty good pronunciation. But yes, so this is, I'm a professor of software engineering, a programmer at heart, and a technology author. Currently, I'm the editor-in-chief of the IEEE software magazine, and recently published the book Effective Debugging, where I detail 66 ways to debug software and systems.
Oh, wow. I think he was also a committer at one point to FreeBSD, if I'm not totally mistaken. Mm-hmm. But I have to research that. The next question is, what will your talk be about exactly at the conference?
I will describe how the architecture of the Unix operating system evolved over the last half century, starting with the unnamed system written for the PDP-7 in assembly language and ending with a modern FreeBSD system. My talk is based first on a GitHub repository where I tried to record the system's history from 1970 until today, and second, on the evolution of documented facilities like user commands, system calls, and library functions across those revisions. I will thus present the early systems defining architectural features like layering, system calls, devices that are files, having an interpreter, and the process management cycle. And the important ones that follow in subsequent releases, like the tree directory structure, user-contributed code, I/O redirections and pipelines, the shell as a user program, groups, pipes, scripts, and all the little languages.
Wow. So for those who are wondering, the talk is at FOSDEM on Saturday, starting at 12. And look at the schedule for the exact room, but this is just a just brief interjection here. So why this topic?
Unix stands as our major engineering breakthrough due to its exemplary design, its numerous technical contributions, its impact, its development model, and its widespread use. Furthermore, the design of the Unix programming environment has been characterized as offering unusual simplification, power, and elegance. Consequently, there are many lessons that we can learn by studying the evolution of the Unix architecture, how it grew over time, which can apply to the design of new systems. I often see modern systems that suffer from a bloat of architectural features and a lack of clear form, which were fundamentally built as part of Unix. I believe that many of the modern Unix architecture's defining features are excellent examples of what we should strive towards as system architects.
So the next question in the interview is, what do you hope to accomplish by giving this talk? What do you expect?
I'd like FOSDEM attendees to leave the talk with their minds full with architectural features of timeless quality. I want them to realize that architectural elegance isn't derived by piling design patterns or does not need to be expensive in terms of resources. Rather, beautiful architecture can be achieved on an extremely modest scale. Furthermore, I want attendees to appreciate the importance of adopting flexible conventions rather than rigid enforcement mechanisms. Finally, I want to demonstrate through examples that the open source culture was part of Unix from its very earliest days.
And what are the most significant milestones in the development of Unix?
The architectural development of Unix follows a path of continuous evolution, albeit at a slow pace. So I don't see here the most important milestones. I would, however, define as significant milestones two key changes in the way Unix was developed. The first occurred in the late 1970s when significant activity shifted from the closed-knit team of researchers at AT&T Bell Labs to the Computer Science Research Group, or CSRG, at the University of California at Berkeley. This opening the system to academic contributions and growth through the competitive research funding. And then the second one took place in the late 80s and early 90s when Berkeley open sourced the code, and it had developed by that time a large percentage of the system, and enthusiasts built on it to create complete open source operating systems like 386BSD, which then went on to become FreeBSD, NetBSD, OpenBSD, and all the others.
Ah, okay. And which areas has the development of Unix stalled?
The data I will show demonstrates that there were, in the past, some long periods where the number of C library functions and system calls remained mostly stable. Nowadays, there is significant growth in the number of all documented facilities with the exception of file formats. I'm looking forward to discussion regarding the meaning of these growth patterns in the Q&A session after the talk.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. And next question is, so what are the core features that still link the 1970 PDP-7 system to the latest FreeBSD 11.1 release almost half a century apart?
Over the past half century, the Unix system has grown by 4 orders of magnitude, from a few thousand lines of code to many millions. Nevertheless, looking at a 1970s architecture diagram and a current one reveals that the initial architectural blocks are still with us today. Furthermore, most system calls, user programs, and C library functions of that era have survived until today with essentially similar functionality. I've even found a modern FreeBSD, some lines of code that have survived unchanged for 40 years.
Okay. Can we still add innovative changes to operating systems like FreeBSD without breaking the Unix philosophy? Will there be a moment where FreeBSD isn't recognizable anymore as a descendant of the 1970 PDP-7 system?
There's a saying that form liberates. So having available a time-tested form of developing operating system functionality allows you to innovate in areas that matter rather than reinventing the wheel. Such concepts include having commands act as a filter, providing manual pages with a consistent structure, supplying build information in the form of a makefile, or installing files in a well-defined directory hierarchy, implementing file systems with a standard object-oriented interface, and packaging reusable functions as a library. With this framework, there's an ample space for both incremental additions, things like the JQ command, which is a JSON query command, and radical innovations, considering the Solaris Device ZFS and dtrace functionality. For this reason, I think that BSD and Linux systems will always be recognizable as direct and or intellectual descendants of the 1970s research Unix editions. FreeBSD 1.0 binaries still run on FreeBSD.
And actually, the chat room pointed out that he's indeed a developer on FreeBSD, and he has made recent commits. It's such a big project that we don't know all the people, especially when they're relatively quiet. Mm-hmm. But it's good to see that these people are still active and around who were with the project even before we were. So, last question. Have you enjoyed previous FOSDEM editions?
Immensely. As an academic, I need to attend many scientific conferences and meetings in order to present research results and interact with colleagues. This means too much time spent traveling and away from home and a limited number of conferences I'm in the end able to attend. Nevertheless, attending FOSDEM is an easy decision due to the world-changing nature of its theme, the breadth of the topics presented, and the participants' enthusiasm and energy, as well as the exemplary, very efficient conference organization. Yes, I would say that there really isn't another conference that has the breadth of topics that FOSDEM has.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty much any open source project you can think of has some people there willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
And
the dev rooms.
Yeah, if you just look at the list of dev rooms, if you just had one talk from each of those topics at a conference, it would be the most diverse conference ever. And instead, they have an entire room with somewhere between half a day and 2 days dedicated to that topic.
Yeah. And the BSDs also have a dev room there. So there's a BSD dev room on Saturday. And the FreeBSD Foundation will also have a booth there or a table where you can come and talk to us and get a little swag going on and get us some stickers maybe. And, talk to people there from the various projects. And it's certainly a good way of, catching up on what's new and what's happening in these individual projects and meet the people behind the code. All right, going to our next story is another vBSDcon trip report that we found somewhere on the net, a little bit hidden, so we couldn't get it right away, over at weaponizedawesome.com. And so this is from vBSDcon last year in September, and it's starting with, recently I had the honor of co-presenting on the internals of FreeBSD's kernel random number generator with John Mark Gurney at the third biennial vBSDcon hosted in Reston, Virginia by VeriSign. So he's been in and out of the FreeBSD community for about 20 years. As I've mentioned on here before, his first Unix encounter was FreeBSD 2.2.8 when I was in the 7th or 8th grade. However, for all that time, I've never managed to get out to any of the cons. I've been to 1 or 2 BSD user group meetings, and I've met some folks from IRC before, but nothing like this. So he'd also not had to do a stand-up presentation, really, since college before this. So, this is quite some time. So his first BSDcon and his first time presenting rolled into one, made for an interesting experience, especially given that it's in his old stomping grounds, however, given he's moved to Texas this past spring. That said, it was amazing and invigorating experience. I got to meet a few big names in the FreeBSD community, discuss projects, ideas for FreeBSD, and more. He did even spend an unusual amount of time talking about FIPS and common criteria with folks, but to me, or to him, that's a good sign and indicate that there is an interest in working to close these gaps between FreeBSD and the current requirements so that they can start getting FreeBSD and more BSD-related or based products into the government and start whittling away the domination of Linux there.
Yeah, especially since Oracle's cut back on Solaris and Spark and ZFS and so on. But, kind of the point there is there's nothing quite that can match the high bandwidth interchange of ideas you can get in person like this at a conference. The internet has made all kinds of communications possible, and we use it all the time. That's how the FreeBSD project happens. But every once in a while, getting together in person has a huge amount of value. And oftentimes you won't realize just how different it is until you try it. So then Dean went on to talk a bit about some of the other talks that he saw that he liked, including George's talk about dtrace, Michael Shirk's talk about security tools on the various BSDs, Michael Zesser's talk about isolated build environments using jails and Beehive and net booting and so on, Jonathan Anderson's talk about Capsicum, which was really well done, and Paul Vixie's talk on GetS, which was very interesting. I think I've convinced him to come to BSDcon and talk about something similar.
Oh, great.
But then Dean had his favorite talk, which really resonated with me as well. He says, I think the talk that really had the biggest impact on me, however, was Kyle Knissel's talk on the BSD community dynamics. One of the key points he asked was whether the things that drew us into the BSD community in the first place would still be able to happen to someone today. Obviously, Dean and all the rest of us are not 12 or 13-year-old kids anymore, but it really got him thinking. Combined with the FaceTime with people I'd previously only known as screen names, I had recently drawn him back into participating in IRC and rejoining the mailing lists and participating in FreeBSD. But yes, I really thought Kyle's talk was important in that, the way I got into FreeBSD is not likely to happen to many people anymore. And, as you've seen from how many interviews, a giant swath of the people that are FreeBSD developers today started working at a dial-up ISP that ran FreeBSD because it was the best choice at the time. There aren't many dial-up ISPs around anymore. It's not going to draw that many people in anymore. Myself and Brian Drury and others kind of got sucked in from the angle of IRC. When IRC servers used to be a lot bigger than they are now, before there were other messaging platforms. And so I think that's something that the projects need to think about is, we've got this nice base of people. The main reason I think that some of the younger people aren't getting in is just because the ways that we got in don't exist anymore, and we need to find what the new ways will be.
Different avenues to approach the project.
Yeah. We have got a bunch of really good young people into the project. They're mostly self-selecting by the fact that they like the old things and want to learn about it or whatever. But we'd like to see more of what we could do to get in front of those people at the right time and make them get interested in BSDs.
Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge. Further on, where were we? Then Dean covered some thoughts on his own talk. So John Mark Gurney and his talk seems to have been well received, with people paying lots of attention. He didn't know that what a typical number of questions for one of these things is, but on day one there weren't that many questions. So they got about 5 for them and for their remaining time, and spend most of them or the rest of the day fielding questions from interested attendees. This is the typical hallway talk or the people who approach you after the talk. So getting a great talk from George Neville Neal after coming down from the stage was probably one of the major highlights for him. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I remember my first solo talk. It was BSDcon 2013, I think. And I was going through a bunch of stuff, and I had some graphs, but I didn't explain them very well. And George, even though I don't think he even was that interested, asked a question about them in order to get me to explain it. He was basically pointing out to me as a speaker what I had missed, but in a way that was just him asking a question. That seemed perfectly fine. But his feedback, both during and after the talk, was a great help to me.
Yeah. He's providing good feedback, and if you take that to heart, then I guess the talk is. I mean, it's the first time, and there are different dynamics always. But I think he's a good judge of good conference talk. All right, going on. I think, or that he thinks, key to the interest of our presentation was that John Mark Gurney did a good job framing a very complicated topic's importance in terms of everyone that they could understand. It also helped that they got to drop some serious truth bombs. So then the final thoughts that he has is that he met a lot of folks in person for the first time and met some people he'd never known online before. That it was a great community, and he's glad that he got a chance to expand his network. And that VeriSign were excellent hosts, and they took good care of both speakers, covering the airfare, the rooms, and also the conference attendees at large. The dinners they hosted were quite good as well.
Yeah, VeriSign even went so far as to subsidize the price of the hotel rooms for everyone. So even if you weren't speaking and you were paying for your hotel room, you paid less than the hotel charged because VeriSign had already paid for some of your room. Yeah,
so this is a great gesture from them, and VeriSign is great in that regard, having that done not just once but twice already. This is the second time.
This is the third. That was
third time.
vBSDcon.
See, excellent. Yeah, so he's definitely interested in attending vBSDcon again, and now that he has had a taste of meeting in real life with the community on scale of more than a handful, he has every intention of finally making it to BSDcon this year, 2018, and this year for sure though. And if you scroll down a little bit in the blog post, you can also see a screenshot from George Neville Neal and Benno Rice doing their famous reading of Savaged by Systemd. So you can see what kind of, how the room was laughing. And it was certainly a good time.
This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by DigitalOcean. head over to digitalocean.com and check out their new droplet pricing.
And the new website.
Yes. They've expanded, changed the layout of the website so it's a little easier to pick through the different sizes of VMs and pick what you want. But in addition to the regular memory and CPU optimized droplets, they've introduced a new type of flexible droplet. So the new $15 price that we were very interested in a couple weeks ago when it came out has been further expanded so that for that $15, you can get whatever layout of RAM versus CPU that makes most sense for you. They've expanded the size of the SSD disk up to 60 gigabytes, no matter what, and you get 3 terabytes of transfer, but then you can choose whether you want a lot of CPUs and only a bit of RAM, or a bit of both, or mostly RAM and less CPU.
Yeah, so depending on your workload or your needs, then you can switch to more memory or to more CPUs, and you can scale that up and down dynamic.
Yes, the other nice thing is you can actually do their scaling thing. So that one requires a reboot, but you can just be like, well, right now I need more CPU and less RAM, so let's reboot it as the CPU-focused one, do all the compiling or whatever, and then switch back to the RAM-focused one or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And they have...
Or just pick the middle ground and have the best of both worlds.
Yeah. And they provide great metrics to see what all your individual droplets are doing in terms of CPU, memory usage, or bandwidth that you're currently consuming. And again, if you don't need the droplets anymore, then you just switch them off and they are not being built towards you anymore.
Have to delete it, not just switch it off.
Or completely delete it, yeah. Not just switch them off, but yeah, remove them completely.
Mm-hmm.
And you can start your DigitalOcean journey with our coupon code, FreeBSD now. Just provide that in the registration sheet when you start your first droplet, and then you get a $10 credit.
Yeah. Other thing, check out, they have all these other services that go on top of the VM that make it even more useful, like Spaces, their object store, or a block storage, which is great for ZFS. They also offer backups. You can just pay 20% of the price of your machine and get a backup. No problem. They have snapshots. You can store those relatively cheaply. They also have floating IPs, so you can have an IP that can move between your droplets and make your load balancing or whatever easy. They have a separate load balancer. They have cloud firewalls, whatever you need. And it's all easy to go. And the pricing is hourly with a monthly cap, meaning that if you only use it for a little while, you pay the cheaper price. If you use it all month, you get a discount over the hourly price.
Mm-hmm. And for those people and for those people who need to manage a lot of those or want to programmatically control the droplets, there's an API, or actually many APIs, for Ruby, for your command line curl, for Go, and for Docker CTL.
Yes, there's a DOCTL command line tool for using their API. It's available in the FreeBSD packages. So just package install DOCTL and zap. It's fairly easy. Just drop your key in and it's good to go. I've used it to delete 45 droplets at once. It's a lot faster than using the web interface to do that.
Yeah, that makes the whole thing manageable and making sure that you can restart all of them at a certain point in time for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, so check out DigitalOcean and don't forget our coupon code FreeBSD now. Okay, our next story is going about teaching. So teaching an almost 40-year-old Unix about Backspace. So if you think that's interesting, then follow us in this story because it's... Yeah,
so this is a guest post over at virtuallyfun.com by Zorhash, and it says, I've been messing with the Unix operating system 7th edition for a while now. V7 dates from 1979, so it's almost 40 years old at this point. The last post was about V7 on x86, but since we're running into various issues with it, I've moved on to a proper installation of V7 on SimH. The internet has done really good. The internet has some really good resources on installing V7 on the SimH. Thus, I set out on my journey on installing it a while ago and had some. It was remarkably uneventful. One convenience that I've been dearly missing since the switch from V7 is the functioning backspace key. There seems to be multiple different definitions of what backspace is. The backspace in ASCII is character number 8, or 0x08, which represents Control H. And then there's also del, or delete, which is ASCII character number 127, or 0x7f, which represents Control question mark. V7 does not accept either for input by default. Instead, the hash character is used as the erase character, and the @ character is used as the kill character. These defaults have been there since Unix v1. In fact, they have been there since Multics, which is what the idea for Unix came from, where they got chosen seemingly arbitrarily. The erase character erases the character before it. The kill character deletes the whole line. For example, BA ## GOOO #D will be interpreted as good because you've deleted the B and the A with 2 backspaces. Type G and then 3 O's and then backspace one of the O's and then D. And then typing bad line @ good line would be interpreted as just good line because you've killed everything preceding the @ character, which would make it really hard to type an email address.
Yeah, but way
Of course,
back when...
email wouldn't be invented for quite a few years after this. So there's some debate on whether backspace or delete is the correct character for terminals to send when the user presses the backspace key. However, most programs are sending delete today. Tmux forces delete, even if the terminal emulator sends backspace. So simply changing my terminal to send backspace was not a good option. The default, or the change from the default outlined here is today's modern AV defaults occurred between 4.1 BSD and 4.2 BSD. The user ENF on Hacker News has written a nice overview of the various conventions. There's a link to that on the article if you're interested. But looking at changing the defaults. And then on generating an actual diff.
Oh yeah, I see.
Code here.
Yeah, this is quite thorough and
for future generations, as well as myself, when I inevitably majorly break this installation of V7, I wanted to make a diff. However, my V7 is installed in SimH. I'm not a very intelligent man. I didn't keep backup copies of the files I'd changed. Getting data out of this emulated machine is an exercise in frustration. Your normal VM, like VirtualBox types or QEMU idea of using a fake Samba share or something isn't going to work on V7 Unix. In the end, I printed everything on screen using cat and copied that out. Then I performed a manual diff against the original source file tree because tabs got converted to spaces in the copy and paste process. Then I applied the change to clean copies that did not have the tabs. And finally, I actually invoked diff and created a diff file that you can actually look at.
Ooh, okay.
He also looked at trying to mount the file system, and he couldn't find anything that could read it except maybe the mount v7fs command on NetBSD. Although doing a whole install of NetBSD just to try to read this disk image seemed a little too much work. But there's lots more detail in the article. But his closing thoughts are, figuring all this out took me a few days. Penetrating how the system is put together was surprisingly fairly hard at first, but then the difficulty curve eased up. It was an interesting exercise in some kind of reverse engineering, and I definitely learned something about the TTY and handling with that. I was, however, not pleased with using ed, the line editor. Even if I know the basics, VI is a blessing that I did not appreciate enough until not having it. But I had also been unable to access recursive grep on my host and scroll through the code. I would, or if he had not been able to access recursive grep on the host and scroll through the code, he probably would have just given up. Writing Unix under these kinds of editing conditions is an amazing feat. I have nothing but the greatest respect for software developers of those days.
Oh yeah, certainly. That's where it all came from or started, and yeah, some of the old Unix folks are like, well, you guys with your modern tools, just look what we had to use.
Yeah, describing my code writing setup to somebody from back then would probably have blown their mind. And they're like, "You have how many computers?"
Yes, yeah.
I just remember hearing the stories of when Robert Ells from Australia would come over to Berkeley, and him and Kirk would share a computer. So one of them would work on it while the other one slept, and then they would switch because there was the one computer, and so they just hot bunked on the seat of that computer, basically.
Oh yeah. No talk about pair programming and all these new fancy models.
It was maximize the time on the computer, so
and
you code, I sleep, and then we'll switch. We shall work in shifts.
Yeah, another type of time sharing. Time for our news roundup this week with exciting news that a new NUMA support is coming to FreeBSD current. This is a mailing list post over at FreeBSD current mailing list by Jeff Robertson. So what's this all about?
Yeah, he says, I'm working on merging improved NUMA support with policy implemented by the CPU set syscall over the next few weeks. This work has been supported by Dell EMC's Isilon product division and by Netflix. And there's some discussion in the 3 different diffs that are on Fabricator. For those that don't know, NUMA is basically the non-uniform memory access. In particular, if you have a machine with 2 or more sockets, but even on some high core count single socket machines now, it's actually 2 separate processors. And so on a typical 2-processor motherboard, you'll have 2 separate banks of memory where all the RAM chips near this socket are connected to that CPU, and the RAM on this socket is connected to the other CPU, which means accessing RAM from the other CPU is slower than accessing it from the CPU that's connected to the RAM. But the same also goes for PCIe devices and everything else. So with that information is presented by the hardware to the operating system. And if used, it means that, hey, if this process is running on CPU number 2, I'm going to allocate its memory from the bank of RAM that's connected to CPU 2 because that'll be faster. And maybe I'll try to avoid migrating it to the other CPU where it's then going to be far away from its RAM. But, maybe the network card it's talking to is actually over here, and so on. And just providing ways to do that. Previously, the approach on FreeBSD was to do round robin, which was allocate every other chunk of RAM from the opposite bank. This provided the worst possible scenario, but that was on purpose because it would mean it would be consistent. Because you're half good and half bad, you would basically get the same level of performance. Whereas with the other policy, you could end up with it's really fast and then suddenly it's a lot slower, and it would be very strange.
Mm-hmm. And for people who don't know who Jeff Robertson is, he wrote the ULE scheduler that's currently being used, or the standard scheduler pretty much nowadays in FreeBSD.
Yeah, so anyway, the work is going on in the project's user Jeff NUMA branch. If you want to look in SVN and see the history and or want to try experiments on the whole branch rather than individual patches. It has been tested extensively by Peter Holm on both i386 and AMD 64 and has been verified to work on ARM at various points through the process. We're working towards compatibility with libnuma and the Linux mbind interfaces. These commits will bring in improved support for NUMA in the kernel. There are new domain-specific allocation functions available to the kernel for the UMA, the memory manager in the kernel. So when you allocate memory, you can say, hey, this should be biased towards this side or that side or whatever. So this includes the malloc, all the kmem functions, and the vmpage functions. Bus DMA mem consumers will automatically be placed in the correct domain. So memory allocated for a device will be in the domain that device is connected to, and which will bring automatic improvements to some device performance problems. CPU set will be able to constrain processes, groups of processes, jails, etc., to subsets of the system memory domain, just as it can with sets of CPUs. So you'll be able to say, this program should only run on this set of CPUs and should only use the memory from those CPUs. It can also set the default policy for any of the above, and threads can use CPU sets to set policy that specify a subset of their visible domains. So if you give a program access to a specific CPU and a specific set of memory domains, it can then give its threads subsets of that. Available policies are first touch, or what Linux calls local, which just means wherever the memory comes from the first time, we'll just keep taking it from there. Round robin, which is like the Linux interleave, where we'll just go back and forth. And preferred, where it'll do it from whichever one it thinks would be best. For now, the default is round robin. You can achieve a fixed domain policy by using round robin with a bit mask of a single domain. As the scheduler and VM become more sophisticated, we may switch the default to first touch, as Linux does. Currently, these features are enabled with the VM NUMA alloc and max mem domain kernel config variables. It will eventually become the NUMA and max mem domain variables, so it'll match the way we do SMP and max CPUs. The current NUMA syscall and the NUMA or VM NUMA alloc code was experimental and will be deprecated, and NUMA CTL itself will continue to be supported, although it will use the CPU set stuff going forward and support a full feature set under the new API. So he says, thank you for your patience as I deal with the inevitable fallout of such sweeping changes. If you have bugs, please fix or file them in Bugzilla or reach out to him directly. I don't always have time to catch up on all of the mailing lists mail, and regularly things slip through the cracks when they're not addressed directly to him. It'll be interesting to see, with this stuff enabled, having Olivier do another set of benchmarks on the routing stuff to see if the device-specific memory allocation stuff will make a big difference there. Although I don't know how much difference will be there until the network stack forwarding code itself has been updated to use the new API.
Yeah, so you see that not just having many CPUs will solve the problems, but also how you schedule properly. So that's the operating system's decision. So we're...
but the first part will be using the memory domain that makes the most sense, especially since your memory might divide it in more than 2, but even like 4 or more domains going forward. And, this especially is going to apply to the newer AMD processors as they become, multiple CCXs on a chip and then possibly multiple sockets. You'll get even more of this happening.
Yeah, this is exciting. And I mean, this makes also the operating system work exciting at some point because, with all these new features and technologies, the operating systems have to eventually support it. And that's why this work is so important. And we thank Dell EMC Isilon and Netflix for supporting this work.
Yep.
All right, moving on. We have some news
over
from
to our friends
OpenBSD.
in OpenBSD.
Yep, because they have something called stack pointer checking. So that sounds exciting. And this is a link that we have here from the OpenBSD tech mailing list from Theo Rat. He writes, Stefan, which is Stefan at openbsd.org, and he have been working for a few months on this diff, which with the help from a few others. So at every trap and system call, it checks if the stack pointer is on a page that is marked map_stack. execve is changed to create such mappings for the process stack. Also, the pthread is taught the new map_stack flag to use with mmap, so when you allocate memory. There is no corresponding system call which can set map flag on an existing page. You can only set the flag by mapping a new memory into place. That is a piece of the security model. The purpose of this is to change, or this change is to thwart stack pivots, which apparently have gained from popularity in just-in-time ROP attacks. It makes it difficult to place the ROP stack in a regular data memory and then perform a system call from that. Workarounds are cumbersome, increasing the need for far more gadgetry. But also the trap case, if any memory experiences a demand page fault, the same check will occur and potentially also kill the process. So they have apparently experimented a little bit with performing this check during device interrupts, but there are some locking concerns and performance may then become a concern. It'll be best to gain experience from a handle of synchronous trap cases first. He also writes Chrome and other applications he runs or he uses are running fine. And he's asking for some feedback to discover what ports will this break, and they would like to know about them. So those would be ports which try to unconventionally create their stacks in malloc memory or inside another data structure. Most of them are probably easily fixed, and then there's the patches attached.
Yeah, this one seems pretty interesting.
And as always, OpenBSD with each change always update the man page as well, which is good to see. Mm-hmm. So all these new features are already documented, even though they're still a little bit in flux and being worked on, but they're still documented so that it's not forgotten. Yeah, it would be nice to maybe see this at a conference or hear a talk about this, because it seems like a little bit more added security to OpenBSD.
It's a bit more code than I was expecting, but not all that much.
Well, since they've been working on that for a few months, then I think they have it already a little better fleshed out now and reduced it a little bit. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly interesting to have that protection. And
this week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by IX Systems. Head over to ixsystems.com/BSDnow and check out their ultimate guide to buying a new server for open source.
Yeah, because these are the questions that you should ask your other vendors, whether they have the same kind of support or the same concern about you as a customer regarding their open source solution. And you quickly find that IX Systems will build exactly the server for your needs in open source.
Yes. I couldn't really be happier with them. We got our new drives in, expanded our pool. It's working very well. Everything's very fast. We are super happy.
60 terabyte do you have now?
66 terabyte drives.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
RAID set 2?
Yeah. It's 5 sets of 12. So if I do a zpool list, it's actually about 300. So if a 6 terabyte drive was 6 terabytes, that would be about 360 terabytes.
But that's not the case.
Because it's not. It's actually about 325 terabytes, but that's before the RAID Z reduction. So I think it works out usable to 250 terabytes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, about 250 terabytes. Maybe a little more towards 260 since we mostly use the larger record size. But that'll mostly depend on the files and so on. But yep, we would have been out of space already if we hadn't got those drives. So we were very happy that I actually get them to us that quickly.
And they also built the actual server they're running in?
Yes, so we bought the original server from them a couple of years ago. And then over time, we needed more for it. So we bought a separate shelf. So basically it looks like another computer, but there's actually no motherboard or CPU in it, just an IPMI module and a controller. And to the original server, we added another LSI HBA, and then external 12 gig SAS cable goes to this second chassis, which is full of hard drives. And then the drives show up in the first server, and we added them to the pool. When we went to do it, IX is like, well, you have these 4 or 5 different options for the size of the shelf you want, and we picked the one that made most sense for us. And then it was down to picking if we wanted dual expander or single expander. Do we need multipath, basically? And we opted to save money and not go with multipath. because we have a complete replica offsite of this. So if there is a problem, we fall over to that rather than depending on multipath SAS. And the nice thing is we can also chain these together so that we could get a second shelf if we manage to fill the first one. Because admittedly, the first shelf is now at 24 out of 44 drives, so there's only room for 20 more drives. And it sounds like we'll fill that before September or so. And if that's the case, then we'll have to get another one of these.
Yeah, and so
also, I think the next 20 drives that go in this existing one might be larger, possibly going at 10 or 12 terabytes or something instead of just 6.
And the drives they ship you?
Yep, so they ship them for you and they pack them so nicely. And already in the hot swap cages, so we didn't have to mess with the screws. So
yeah, that's what I was
went
getting
to the data center, opened the box, dropped the drives in, zpool add with -n to make sure it looked right first because you can't undo it.
Yeah, that's good practice.
And then it was like, oh, look, lots of free space. No, nothing else to do. We can go home now. It was so uneventful. It was awesome.
Yeah, and that's what
it makes me feel better that if I had to do this at a data center that I couldn't get to physically myself, that it would be easy enough that, it would just be there. If at one of these remote data centers, they'll do up to so much work for us for free if it doesn't require a screwdriver. So if we send them a box with 12 hard drives in it and they just plug them in, they'll do that. But if they had to sit there and put the drives in the caddies for us, they would bill us for a couple of hours of work. The fact that IX takes care of that was awesome. And the price I got on the drives was cheaper than I could find them anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So I was like, well, that's a no-brainer. Do it.
And if you're looking for a little bit smaller than the system that Alan is typically ordering, then check out their FreeNAS Mini or the Mini XL for your home or office backup needs. So that's
the Mini's great. I would go with the Mini XL because you're eventually going to need more space.
As one does. And
but,
so
you can't always just get bigger and bigger hard drives, but once you have the storage, you will find that it's usually cheaper to buy more storage than to spend the time deciding what you can get rid of.
Yeah.
Because you'll inevitably get rid of something that later on you decide, actually, I could have used that.
Yeah. And so IX Systems will also, if you want to have a server that's built to your needs, they will tell you which components fit well together or work properly together and provide a certain performance for you so that your server provides the exact performance or the speed or the memory capacity, whatever you need for your open source needs in this case.
Okay. Moving on.
We have an article here about Qt or Qt 5.9 on FreeBSD. I think the people say Qt now.
I say Qt.
Yeah,
but I don't know anything.
Depending on who you ask. So this is a little blog post, I guess. Starting with Tobias and Raphael have spent the past month or so hammering on the Qt or Qt 5.9 branch, which has finally landed in the official FreeBSD ports tree. This brings FreeBSD back up to date with current Qt releases, and more importantly, up to date with the Qt release KDE software is increasingly expecting. With Qt 5.9, I say Qt now, whatever. The Elisa music player works, for instance. There were some runtime errors on Qt 5.7, even if it compiles. The KDE FreeBSD CI system has had Qt 5.9 for some time already, but that was hand-compiled and jimmied into the system rather than being a proper ports build. And the new Qt version uses a new build system, which is one of the things that really slowed us down from a packaging perspective, because some modules have been reshuffled into the process, and some applications, depending on Qt internally, the private headers there have been fixed along the way. And the Telegram desktop client continues to be a pain in the butt that way. Following on from Qt 5.9, there has been some work in getting ready for Clang 6 support. In general, the KDE and Qt stack is clean and modern C++, so it's more instructional or infrastructural, actually. Infrastructural tweaks that more than fixing code. And outside of our silo, I still need lots of wonky C++ code, or still see a lot of wonky C++ code having been fixed, and plenty of confusion between pointers and integers and strings and chars and speaking of I'm still planning to clean up Qt4 on ARM and ARM64 architectures for FreeBSD. This boils down to stealing suitable G-atomic implementations from Arch Linux. And for regular users of Qt applications on FreeBSD, there should be a few to no changes required outside the regular upgrade cycle. KDE Plasma users note that development of the ports has changed branches. As they get closer to actually landing modern KDE bits, things have been renamed and reshuffled a little bit and mulled over, so often that the old Plasma 5 branch wasn't really right anymore. So the KDE 5-import branch is where it's at nowadays, and the instructions are the same. So the X11/KDE5 meta port will give you all the KDE frameworks, KDE 5, the Plasma desktop, and modern KDE applications as you need.
Yep. So if you want to try that out, you have to go over there and get the KDE 5-import branch of the ports tree, and you can try out Plasma on FreeBSD and let them know how it goes.
Mm-hmm. And thanks for the people who are doing the work, porting these applications. As you can see, it's not just a simple application. It's a huge beast and a lot of dependencies and applications that come with the desktop environment. So thanks for all the work people put in there. So have KDE on FreeBSD.
Next up, we have a blog post from our friend Dan Langille, who runs BSDcon, among other things. He also runs Freshports, actually. And he says, Freshports recently moved to a new IPv6 capable server, but until the day of this post, that capability had not been utilized. There were a number of things I needed to configure, but this will not necessarily be an exhaustive list of what you will have to follow. Some steps might be missed and might not apply in your situation. All in all, it took him about 3 hours to do. So the server, he wanted to have both incoming HTTP and HTTPS connections arrive in the jail host. The connections are redirected to a FreeBSD jail running Nginx listening on the LO1 interface, and Nginx listens on non-routable addresses. So his IPv6 gateway on the Freshport server, I had to set the upstream IPv6 gateway using the IPv6_default router directive in rc.conf. And then after that, he wanted to configure IPv6 for Nginx. At present, Nginx listens on the 127.1.0.201 on the second loopback adapter. And you can see he has his configuration there. I will use a unique local address for IPv6 for Nginx on the server. So he chose FD00::201 and set that up. And then in the jail, he added the IPv6 address and restarted it. So now when he runs ifconfig inside the jail, he sees his v4 and v6 addresses. Then he just had to add it to Nginx, which is adding the listen directive. The square brackets are used because traditionally we've had the IP address : the port number. But because instead of using dots, IPv6 addresses are separated by colons, you need to be able to differentiate what's a colon that's part of the address and what's the colon that's part of the port number. So the entire address goes in square brackets to solve that.
So it's a different
So then he
notation.
ran Nginx config test, and he saw that the INET 6 sockets are not supported on this platform, and he had to recompile Nginx with IPv6 support. So he went in there, changed IPv6 support to on in his Poudriere setup, rebuilt, reinstalled, restarted Nginx, and it worked fine. And then once he did that, he ran sockstat and found all the v6 sockets listening on port 443, and you can see all the HTTPS happening. Then he had to open a hole in the firewall and actually redirect that traffic to the loopback interface so it would go into the jail. And once he'd done that, he could connect to it.
Very nice. Yeah, I like the thoroughness of Dan, not just doing this for himself, but also putting it out on the web, not just for him to remember, but also for other people to reference this and see, I did the same changes, and the steps are correct, and I can do pretty much the same steps at home or at work, wherever.
I know Dan has found it useful many times when asking for help when he gets stuck. Having already written out everything he's done makes it easy for me or other people like Josh that were helping him to follow through what he had done and be like, well, there's where you missed a step, or okay, I understand where you actually are now, instead of me kind of giving you generic advice and then finding out, oh, but you did this other thing over here and I didn't realize it, and that changes everything or whatever. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I think he also had to add the IPv6 DNS records so that when you look up the website for Freshports, you will get an IPv6 address so that you actually connect to it. And then he had another machine do a test and actually see the address. And so he's good to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, IPv6 is still not on too many people's minds because they can just do fine with IPv4. But if they do, they can pretty much follow Dan along with his IPv6 migrations and tip their toe into the IPv6 world. All right. Next story.
We have a blog post from TrueOS on ZFS on TrueOS, Why We Love Open Zfs.
Oh, I can already see where this is going. Mm-hmm. I like those titles.
TrueOS was the first desktop operating system to fully implement OpenZFS, the enterprise file system, as a stable production environment. To fully understand why we love ZFS, you have to look back to the early days of TrueOS when it was called PCBSD. The development team had been using the UFS file system in TrueOS because of its solid track record with FreeBSD-based computer systems and its ability to check file consistency with the built-in utility FSCK. However, as computing demands increased, problems began to surface. The amount of time it takes to run FSCK on a large file system became problematic. Didn't really offer much in the way of replication, and rsync and so on is slow, and the inconsistency in the data integrity. While using UFS for logging, even with the journaling, it could truncate log files and otherwise hinder users. It quickly became apparent that TrueOS users would need a file system that scales with evolving enterprise storage needs, offers the best data protection, and works well in both a hobbyist and desktop environment. Chris Moore, the founder of the TrueOS project, first heard of OpenZFS in 2007 from the chatter on the FreeBSD mailing list. In 2008, the TrueOS development team was thrilled to learn that FreeBSD project had ported ZFS to FreeBSD. At the time, ZFS was still unproven as a graphical desktop solution, but Chris saw a perfect opportunity to offer ZFS as a cutting-edge file system option in the TrueOS installer, allowing the TrueOS project to act as an indicator to how well OpenZFS would fare in real-world production use. The team was blown away by the reception and quality of OpenZFS on FreeBSD-based systems. By its nature, its file system and block of data, it will instead write the new one and then update the pointer. This way, if the power goes out or if the system crashes, the old version of the data is still available in case the new one hasn't been completely written yet. Whereas in an overwriting file system, you've overwritten half of the old data and not the other half. And what you end up with is probably not all that useful.
Yeah, and just for this feature, you already start loving OpenZFS or ZFS in general. But there's more.
And then,
on top of that,
ZFS is able to assure that data stays consistent between writes by automatically checking checksums and mitigating bit rot that way. It also has the native RAID Z functionality, which allows you to get enterprise levels of redundancy for free, and with snapshots that allow system configuration backups in a split second. And you read that right. TrueOS can back up and restore snapshots in less than a second. And then over time, we grew boot environments, and suddenly it didn't make sense to even consider any other or file system for your desktop.
It's becoming so easy at one point, and just why should I use another file system unless I'm on an embedded device? And you just don't want to get back from ZFS anymore because you just get to know these features and fall in love with them and never will use another file system that doesn't have them.
These advantages, the TrueOS team decided to use ZFS as the exclusive file system starting back in 2013, and we haven't looked back since. ZFS offers TrueOS users the stable workstation experience they want, while simultaneously scaling to meet the increased demands of the enterprise storage market. TrueOS users are frequently commenting on how easy it is to use ZFS snapshots with the built-in snapshot utility. This allows users the freedom to experiment with their system, knowing that they can restore it in seconds if anything goes wrong. If you haven't had a chance to try ZFS with TrueOS, browse over to our download page and make sure to grab a copy of TrueOS. You'll be blown away with the ease of use, the data protection, and the flexibility of RAID Z.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, ZFS is also not getting in the way of your desktop use. It's just there when you need it, and otherwise, if you don't need it, then it's just in the background and keeping your data secure.
Yeah, in the end, if it wasn't for ZFS and snapshots, I wouldn't consider updating my laptop the week before going to FOSDEM.
Yeah,
it just
before
wouldn't even be a thing.
I'm going out the door in an hour. Let's do this update here. And it works. And even if it doesn't work, you can still fall back to the old version.
Exactly. There's no reason not to do it, basically.
And as always, at this point in the show, we have the Beastie Bits for you, starting with Source Code podcast interview with Michael W. Lucas. So apparently, in Season 2, Episode 7 of Chris Sanders' Source Code podcast, Michael Lucas was interviewed, and this is over at Michael Lucas' blog here. It's a tech podcast, yes, but as Chris and I are both writers, we talk writing. Plus growing up in a farm town, reading, and the assorted unspeakable horrors of the literary life. Chris not only donates his book royalties to the Rural Technology Fund when he interviews someone on his podcast, he donates $100 to a charity of the guest's choice. And Michael Lucas chose the Soroptimists International of Grosse Pointe, I think that's correct, who are doing good boots-on-the-ground work on Detroit's human trafficking problems. They're less the ladies who lunch and more the ladies who lounge. The bad news is lounge. It's very similar. The bad news is that they, of course, discussed Savaged by Systemd. Somehow they kept the podcast's PG rating.
I'm not sure how they managed that.
It'll certainly be interesting to listen to that. If only I had a long enough flight coming up to listen to this one. Cool. And it's a nice idea to donate these, charity. That's cool. So check out that podcast.
Next up, W3Techs has their Blah of the Year award. And for Operating System of the Year, first place went to Ubuntu, and second to CentOS, but third place went to NetBSD.
Oh, we're catching up.
Mm-hmm. But they also have lots of other rankings on here, including Content Management System of the Year, Server-Side Programming Language of the Year, JavaScript Library of the Year, SSL Authority of the Year. Is Let's Encrypt not on there?
Well, should be the only one.
I didn't trust who won is one of the root certificates that's used by Let's Encrypt. So I guess technically that counts.
Yeah. Oh, wow. There's a lot of stuff here. Yeah.
Yeah. But a BSD made it for Operating System of the Year, so that's pretty good.
It's a good start for the year, and maybe next year they're in a higher place.
The choice was NetBSD.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how these were generated or how the ranking was made. Yeah. But yeah, certainly this is good news, and for the people who always say that BSD is dying, that this is your response to that. Next up, OpenSense 18.1 release candidate 1 is out. So there's new stuff happening there.
There's a full change list, quite a bit. Stuff updates to the system, the firewall, the interface, the firmware, the installer, etc.
Oh yeah, this seems like coming along nicely until the actual release is out. So.
Based on FreeBSD 11.1 P6.
Okay. So that's the for the people who are into OpenSense, should check out the new release and maybe send us a little report how that went or about the general OpenSense ecosystem. Would be nice to cover this in a future episode. Maybe send that to feedback@bsdnow.tv. Next up is a personal OpenBSD wiki notes. So this is always good to see people writing down their findings and how they do things on wikis. And this is over at Read the Docs. And there's some stuff here for OpenBSD folks.
They talk about what's missing in OpenBSD as of the end of 2017. Bluetooth, trim support for SSDs, and Adobe Flash. I noticed Bluetooth was getting a bunch of work in FreeBSD recently. Trim support on SSDs has been around for a while. And Flash is mostly going away, so maybe that'll be better.
Cool. Yeah, there's some nice stuff here. Base system, upgrades, and so these are small bits and pieces, but these might just be the things that people are Googling for. All right.
Even covers, how to increase and decrease the volume using Mixer CTO, how to set up your Wi-Fi, etc. Even how to connect Cisco AnyConnect VPN.
Cool. Hey, this is some of these things could also be used on other BSD systems because they're not too OpenBSD specific. Let me bookmark this real quick, so I don't have to look at the show notes one more time. Okay. Next up, there's a BSD section that can use some contributions. Oh, this is something for people to start with.
FreeCodeCamp has a big index here, and they have BSD operating system, and there's no articles yet. And ask, could you write one? Seems like the listeners of the podcast might be just the right people for this.
Yeah, definitely add some more content. Because there are many ways people...
There's none right now, so more shouldn't be very difficult.
And sometimes people stumble upon not the official FreeBSD handbook, but go via other ways. And if there's enough information out there, then the better chances that they find the BSDs interesting and use them.
Yeah, there's a small blurb about FreeBSD and links to Wikipedia. I'm sure that could be expanded quite easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so people, if you're in the mood or just want to edit a couple of sections there, then by all means get started.
Then lastly, an interesting GitHub repo, the third Research Edition Unix Programmer's Manual. This repository maintains the tools for formatting and making available the Unix Programmer's Manual 3rd edition from February 1973. The generated formatted manual is available as a PDF. The man pages and tools are derived from the 1976 material unearthed by Dennis Ritchie and made available through the Unix Heritage Society. This is a last edition of the manual that was created in NROF, which is line printed form, rather than typeset with TROF. I corrected some minor markup glitches through commits that were recorded in this repository. You can find the evolution of the man pages in the Unix history repository. Furthermore, you can find the evolution of the corresponding facilities in a series of tables below.
Okay. Oh, wow. There's a lot of stuff here.
But a PDF of the original Unix Programmer's Manual might be an interesting read.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I see the the typography already and the dates. Oh, wow. Cool. Very nice.
And the feedback section of today's episode is brought to you by Tarsnap, backups for the truly paranoid. So if you head over to tarsnap.com/BSD now and sign up, you can get started with just $5. It's pay-as-you-go backups. So you only pay, you put some money in your account and you get charged 25 cents per gigabyte and you back up whatever you need. It's all encrypted on your computer with source code you can verify. There's no other way to securely back up your system this easily.
Yeah, so they have a handy little flowchart down here so you can see how this works in the section why use Tarsnap. So imagine you have a bunch of megabytes to back up because that's something you want to preserve for eternity, hopefully. And then Tarsnap will go ahead with the client and deduplicate this first and segment this into proper chunks and creates hashes out of them. So that's not what you have to worry about. It's all been done by the client. Then it compresses that so that already will save a bunch of data. And that encoded blocks, which are then also encrypted, of course, with your private key, are then, once they are finished encrypted, being stored on the AWS cloud and alongside other people's data, which no one can read because they're the only person who are holding the decryption key. And that's the whole thing. But Tarsnap makes that easy for end users to use, even if they don't even know Tarsnap or Tar that well. They have also a desktop client, and there are typical also clients available for the Linuxes, the BSDs, and Mac OS as well.
Yep. And we'd also like to thank Colin for, as he's done each year, donating the operational profits for the month of December from Tarsnap to the FreeBSD Foundation.
Yep, we were super grateful for that, and it was certainly a good amount of money, and so great. And if people have an account at Tarsnap, they pretty much help donate as well.
Mm-hmm. But the main thing is that you want your backups and you want them to be secure, and it's the only way to make sure that they are. They have to be encrypted on your machine. You need to be able to verify the source code of the client. There's really no other way to do this. So Tarsnap's the best bet, and it's easy to use and super easy to get started. When you sign up, they don't ask you questions they don't need to know. They realize, hey, you're using Tarsnap because you're paranoid about your security. We're not going to ask you more questions than we need to know.
Yep. So check out Tarsnap and make sure that your backups are always secured, and make sure that you back up your key as well. All right.
Okay, feedback.
Yep. We have feedback and questions as always, as long as you submit it to us. So if anything is bothering you in the BSD world, then send it to feedback@bsdnow.tv and we'll try to help you. The first one this week is Alex with his first FreeBSD bug submission. So he submitted bug 223349, and here's a link in the show notes. And he's at a loss of what else he can do to gather info or help it fix. So this is, let me look at that real quick.
Yes, I replied to this email earlier, and he did some further testing, and it turns out his particular model of motherboard has the bug where it doesn't like booting off GPT, so he chose MBR from the installer, and it's working for him now.
Okay, so that the bug is closed at this point. It's been resolved in one way or the other. So yeah, if you don't hear anything, we can't push all these bugs to the limelight. But if you haven't heard about this in a while, or it's stuck somewhere, maybe we can help and connect you to the right people who could take a look. Yep. Next up is John with suggested speakers. So that's probably involving the interviews that we do from time to time. He writes, "Gentlemen, long-time listener, first-time feedback provider. Thank you for producing a great podcast, including the pre-recorded you maintain weekly in regularity. Your podcast makes an ugly commute to go by quickly and productively." Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you, too, for promoting BSD conferences. He finally made it to his first, which was WeBSDcon, with our arm twisting.
So you owe us a trip report.
Yeah, just another one. Yeah. So he has 2 suggested speakers. So will we be able to have the TrueOS member on or about the upcoming TrueOS stable release?
Yes, we always try to reach out to people from TrueOS. We know most of them, so we can probably get somebody at some point.
Yep.
Did you have a specific question about TrueOS that you wanted us to talk about? We need a bit more of a topic so we can help come up with the questions.
Yeah.
But we'd love to know what people want to know about TrueOS.
Latest developments, what future plans they have. Okay, the second one is Paul Vixie's vBSDcon talk was time well spent, and he would love to hear him on our show talk more about his mentoring junior engineers towards defensive programming, including the least privilege principle and ability to survive, be liberal in what you accept, and conservative in what you send.
Yeah, Paul's traveling a lot right now, but I'm working on getting him cornered.
Where he has no escape unless he speaks into a microphone.
Yeah, basically. Do plan to manage to get him cornered at some point and get him on here. Also been trying to corner a certain FreeBSD developer who let slip that they're working on an interesting project the other day.
Ooh, okay.
I'm coming for you, Darius.
Okay. Yeah, so he wishes us happy hacking and podcasting. Yeah, thank you, John, and hopefully see you at the next BSD conferences, because one isn't just enough. Okay, next one is Todd with 2 questions for us. He writes, "Hi guys, I'll be brief. Love the show and effort you guys put in every week. First episode 20 went over FreeBSD jails. Towards the end, we mentioned putting out another more advanced tutorial, which never appeared. Could we guys work on that, or maybe give him some tips?" So he's...
Yeah, tutorials are hard, so we don't really do that anymore.
Because, when you start speaking, you focus too much on telling people about the tutorial or the stuff that you're currently doing.
Writing a tutorial is a huge amount of time, and just none of the 3 of us that build the podcast have that amount of time currently.
If you have found a good tutorial, we could cover it on the show so that people are more aware about that. Because it's pretty much doesn't matter who's presenting the tutorial as long as the content is fine and makes people make stuff work at the end. So that's the trade-off we have to do. We cannot do any more of these tutorials, but we hope to cover as many as we find on the web. So he's trying to find the best way to combine ZFS and VDEVs and VDEVs anyway.
I don't know if that was supposed to say VDEVs or
probably
what, and I don't know what SCH is either.
Yeah, and Beehive and jails together. So in addition, if we have a good info on PCI pass-through, he would love to run an OpenBSD firewall with carp and RelayD as a VM in front of it. That should be possible, but the pass-through is still...
so once you do pass-through, it's like unless you have a cable that goes out of one NIC and into another NIC in the same system, how are you going to network them together if you actually do hardware pass-through?
Okay. Yeah, that could... I haven't... Maybe at BeehiveCon we hear a little bit more about using that feature with PCI pass-through, because I'm also interested in that.
Well, so PCI pass-through for NICs works, and you can pass through into a Beehive. But if you're trying to put that in front of the computer you're talking about, you're going to actually have to have a loopback cable, like going from one NIC to another NIC in the same machine.
Yeah.
Because you're choosing to use OpenBSD for the firewall, I'm guessing that performance isn't going to be all that big of a deal. You're probably talking 1 gigabit or less. So a virtual NIC is probably fine there and solves most of the problems about doing that. So you might be best to just skip the PCI pass-through, run OpenBSD in a VM, with multiple virtual NICs, and then just wire it up that way.
Mm-hmm. Yep, okay. So he has little stumbling blocks with exacting traffic on the WAN interface using RelayD to do load balancing if it's a tapped jail and send the output to the LAN NIC. But yeah, It should be doable.
I think there was a follow-up email maybe that had more detail. We'll have to look for that. And then question number 2, that's Benedict, you did a great slideshow on Ansible and FreeBSD, and would love to see further examples on spinning up and configuring VMs and configuring, say, reverse proxies like Relay Day or whatever with Ansible.
That should be doable. I mean, the VM support is there for multiple types of VMs, but they're still not too aware of that there is Beehive out there and how to create jails from Ansible. But yeah, basically running these scripts concurrently is not too difficult. If you get the basics, then you can apply it to many other virtualization techniques or other system utilities. Yeah, thanks for your feedback. There will be an updated Ansible tutorial by me at AsiaBSDcon with a few more things that I learned in the meantime. So these slides keep getting updated as the system evolves. Okay, next up is Matthew with a question on CentOS on FreeBSD, or CentOS to FreeBSD. It's a migration story.
Converting,
excellent.
yes.
Okay, so he writes, so, hi Alan and Benedict, I've been playing around with FreeBSD for a while now, and he's finally ready to start switching his home infrastructure to it. Business to come later if all goes well. He wants some advice from us about migrating from CentOS 7 to FreeBSD. So he has some things here.
He wants to run DNS servers, an MB server, which is media, and a backup server. He says, I can configure bind easily enough, but don't know much about jails or how performance compares for things like the MB or Plex server. So you don't have to use jails, but you can. And then, yes, setting up bind is about the same. For Plex, there's a package you can just install. I'm not sure about MB. I've never used that. But in general, it's not all that different. And then the jails just basically are the same as having multiple separate installs of FreeBSD. And so you might be best to just pick a jail manager like IOCage and let it do that. There's a number of tutorials about that out there that should make it pretty easy. Specifically for MB and Plex, it might be worth looking at some of the stuff on the FreeNAS forums because it's very popular to do that with FreeNAS, and they'll have maybe some advice. Although it may be a little specific to FreeNAS, but it gives you an idea.
Yeah, it's certainly there's certainly a migration path, and as long as you can keep the two side by side and copy stuff over you forgot maybe some config file, and then switch off the old stuff once you're sure that they work fine as before, then this is certainly a thing that could be totally working. Last but not least is Brian with a question about OpenBSD 6.2 and Enlightenment 17. So he writes, I've been a Linux user but new to BSD and setting up Enlightenment, getting debus daemon absent errors. He can't find any information to set up this properly. It seems all information is for previous versions of OpenBSD. Do we have any suggestions? Oh, there's a follow-up also. Message bus replaces debus daemon. Now he can load any window manager, but Enlightenment 17 won't. He gets.
You might have to compile Enlightenment without the debus option or something. I'm not that familiar with OpenBSD on the desktop. Sorry.
Yeah, that could be an option to get the newest version. Or look at the, I think they also have a mailing list, OpenBSD ports, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe that has been covered there before, or there's a bug report for this exact same issue, which usually has a bunch of people discussing the bug and what possibly could solve that. But I think it's certainly possible to get OpenBSD running Enlightenment 17. Okay, that covers the feedback and questions section for this week. We'll be at FOSDEM over the weekend, so if people want to say hi, by all means do that. And the week after that will be filled with a whole bunch of new experiences and stuff to talk about because we've been at an exciting conference.
Indeed. So we look forward to seeing you guys at the conference or next week on the show.